Hey guys, Cybertile here, back with all things chess. We're continuing our study of isolated queen pawns. We've gone through pushing through d4, d5, which is really the main pawn break in the position, and then we went over a couple of Botvinnik examples of forcing through f4 to f5, which is sort of a reserve pawn break if black has managed to sufficiently occupy d5 and control d5. We're going to move on to what usually happens a lot more often in isolated queen pawns, because the plan of f4, f5, it's a part of the theory of isolated pawns, but it is admittedly a lot more rare. It's just sort of a background idea that you always want to make sure that you have a grasp on. But really the main bread and butter of isolated queen pawn positions, if black maintains proper control of d5, is using pure piece play to attack the kingside and try to foment weaknesses and take advantage of those. So the first game we're going to look at in that series is Romanishin against Ljubojevic. This was the PCA event in 1993 in Groningen. Both these guys have a very attractive style. Just a word about Romanishin real quick. His impact on modern theory is really underestimated. A lot of basic opening positions that we use today were influenced by Romanishin's hand. He had a very unique style, and a lot of theoretical novelties completely changed the complexion of modern theory. He deserves a lot more credit than he gets, but anyways, Romanishin was white here. d4, d5, c4, 6-6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6. This is the standard semi-Slav. There are a million different moves here. e3 is sort of the cautious, well, it doesn't necessarily need quiet positions, because these can still be razor sharp, but it's quieter for the semi-Slav. There's e3 here. Bishop g5 leads to the main craziness. This can lead to, just demonstrate. 4, 5. And I'll stop the moves there because it's far afield from what we're actually looking over in this line. But this is the Botvinnik semi-Slav, and this goes on for another 25 moves of theory. I'm not exaggerating. The theory from here is just heavy and absurd. This was well analyzed back in the 80s, and especially correspondence chess and computer chess has only added to it since then. Problem is, it's hard to touch these lines for practical play. If you're playing over the board, it's hard to come to the board with 35 moves of accurately remembered theory prepared. It's so difficult to play these lines. So a lot of these lines have sort of slipped away from practical play just because they're so difficult to handle. But yeah, e3 and bishop g5 are the two main moves here. Romanishin played queen d3, which I personally think is a little bit underrated. It's not the best move according to the engine, of course. It is moving your queen a bit too early in the opening. But it at least leads to interesting positions, and it leads to the sort of positions that white can control. Like, white is going to be the one setting the pace here. He's not going to let black decide the structure, which a lot of times happens in the Slav and the semi-Slav. It does make some strategic sense, though. It's defending c4, so this isn't going to be a gambit continuation, and it's controlling e4, so in one move, white's ready to play e4 and fight for the center, which is a good thing. Now, of course, the downside is he is moving the queen fairly early in the opening, so he is losing some time. Objectively, like I said, not the best move, but it's a great way to get sort of a unique position and get out of theory as quickly as possible. I certainly don't mind it. And immediately, Ljubojevic actually goes a little bit wrong. He plays knight a6. I mean, this can't be right. There are times when the knight on the side of the board isn't necessarily a bad thing. That knight definitely doesn't belong there. I think most natural would be to take on c4, queen takes, and then b5. And this is very normal Slav stuff. The pawn could advance to b4 in the next move, or just play some... Let's get a move on the board. Or black could just play bishop b7, and then just the normal Slav moves of knight bd7, a6, and then c5. And that has to be equal for black, at least. Yeah, Ljubojevic played knight a6, which just doesn't belong there, because after a3, which is what Romanishin played in the game, Now, the knight doesn't really have an attractive way home. It can go to c7, which reroutes it to d5 in certain positions. But that's about it. Otherwise, that knight really is poorly placed. So Romanishin did play a3. Also prevents bishop b4, which in some structures matters. Sometimes black would want to have bishop b4 available as a riposte against e4. So a3 actually does two decent things at once. c5. This is a poorly timed structural change. Because actually here, white's technically up in development. He has 3 pieces out, black only has 2. And the black king is a little bit more exposed than the white king, which matters in some variations. Black should have just contented himself with being slightly worse and playing bishop e7. That's just normal, calm development. And then white could follow up with e4. And like I said, white's a little bit better, but nothing cataclysmic. But c5 is poorly timed. Romanishin didn't choose the correct choice. I don't want to go into too many opening subtleties because I want to get to the isolated queen pawn parts. Romanishin played e3. In the notes, I give the best move cx d5. Because white is up in development, it's perfectly reasonable for him to saddle black with the isolated pawn and try to work against that weakness. And I give that variation in the PGN notes, which as usual will be in the comments for the video. But Romanishin played e3, cd, ed, queen x d4 is also possible. You can look at that in the notes. It leads to a different sort of game, but it is also decent enough for white. But white chooses to take on the isolated pawn here. And just like the other isolated pawns positions we've looked at, we can sort of take stock here. This is definitely a unique one in our repertoire so far. So the queen is already out. The queen is on c4. That's sort of unique for our study so far. And the knight is on a6, and that's certainly unique. In a lot of the positions that we've been looking at, the knight's been either on c6, d7, or b6. a6 is definitely a little bit farther away from the action. Now, the good news is the knight can move to c7 and get itself to d5. But there is this concept, if any of you ever read your Dvoretsky, which you absolutely should if you're trying to improve, there's the theory of the superfluous piece. So let's say, let me just put some random moves on the board. Just so we can have that position on the board. It doesn't matter what the moves are. The knight managed to get from a6 to d5, so theoretically it's improved itself. But now the knight on f6 doesn't have access to that square. So the pieces are supporting each other. But if white refuses to trade, they're just sort of sitting there connected to each other. They're not necessarily accomplishing anything by being connected. That's the theory of the superfluous piece, that if white were to avoid trading on d5, it would leave the knight on f6 a little bit useless. So the connection of that, if black does decide to improve that knight on a6 by getting it to d5, it's good for that knight, but it also leads to a bit of a devaluation for the knight on f6. But here, I would say the queen on c4 and the knight on a6 sort of equal each other out. This is just sort of a normal isolated queen pawn position. So black does play knight c7 to get his knight back in the game. White plays bishop d3. a6, this is a little bit slow with time. Bishop e7 is probably better. You want to get your king castled as quickly as possible, especially when the center's open, and this is a little bit open. But a6, knight e5. This is an excellent move from Romanishin. The knight almost always goes to e5 in these isolated queen pawn positions. There's no knight in c6. The square on e5 is completely unchallenged and unchallengeable. So that knight on e5 is more or less an outpost square. You know, black could theoretically kick it with f6, but that would be a huge pawn weakness. So that knight e5 is extraordinarily strong, and this sort of more or less prevents b5. If black tried to play that, queen c6, and then queen f3, and this is more or less a mess for black. There are even some positions where white's threatening g4 here, if black doesn't get ready to castle immediately. But otherwise, black's position is just a complete mess here. Knight c6 is possible. Black has weaknesses everywhere. But after knight e5, he finally plays bishop e7 to get developed. Castle, castle. Bishop c2. So this is the standard isolated queen pawn move. he's setting up to play queen d3. That battery, with the bishops on c2 and the queen on d3, it's one of the most important piece configurations in the isolated queen pawn repertoire. You want to be able to get that battery pointed at the king side to generate weaknesses. If you're never able to get that battery and generate those weaknesses on the king side, you're not getting that play on the king side, and it's less likely that you're getting compensation for the isolated pawn with activity. So bishop c2, absolutely standard. Bishop d7, not the best now that black is castled. b5 is possible. I'll just give a quick line here. c5. And this is a perfectly good position for both sides. This is going to be a very sharp fight. I would say it's completely equal. I would take white subjectively just because I typically prefer white's activity in these. I think the isolated queen pawn, the weakness itself is fairly easily manageable, even in endgames, whereas the activity, it's typically harder to defend against a kingside attack than defend one weakness in an endgame. But that's just a personal preference on my part. Yeah, this sort of position, each side can be happy. If you like playing an isolated queen pawn, this sort of position, you've got your pieces pointed at the king side, you've massaged the weakness g6 out of the black king side. This should be exactly what you're looking for. But black is quite solid as well. g6 isn't a huge weakness by itself unless h4, h5 comes in, and now the queen's on h3, so it'll take another move. And then black has a nice light squared hold on the position. He could move a rook to c8, try to put pressure on the queen side a little bit. But bishop d7, it's passive, whereas b5, it's more active. B5 is gaining space, pushing white back, fighting for squares, whereas bishop d7 is passive. It just sort of sits back and lets white do what he wants. So white plays queen d3, setting up that standard battery. Bishop b5, this is what black had in mind. He's looking to trade his bad light squared bishop. But even a bad bishop has some uses. And you can see in the previous position, that light squared bishop wasn't so bad. That was roaring down the long diagonal. Black could have easily made that piece work for him instead of just trading it off. And the fact that he's investing bishop d7 and bishop b5 just to trade it off, that investment of time matters. And that's time that white has spent creating that bishop and queen battery to massage the king side. So white takes, then bishop e3. This is a good isolated queen pawn position for white. White has the bishop pair. That's almost always an asset in isolated queen pawn positions. He's got that battery established. He's got the bishop on c2 and queen to d3, so he can start massaging for that weakness on the king side to proceed with his play. This is a good position for white. This is, if you play an isolated queen pawn, this is something you're very happy with. So Ljubojevic plays rook c8. Maybe not the strongest. Knight d6 makes a little bit more sense because it gets that knight closer to the king side to potentially defend if needed. Rook c8. Rook a d1. In middle games, it's often very, very difficult to decide where to put your rooks. A lot of time can be wasted thinking over the classic question of which rook. Like in this position, white could have thought for about half an hour whether to put the f rook on d1 or the a rook on d1. Here it's clear that the f rook goes to e1. But in general, you just want to get your rooks to a decent square in practical play. You don't want to spend over half an hour on the decision. You just want to get your rooks where they make sense and then move on with play. Typically, for any isolated queen pawn position, the rooks being on the d and the e file make a lot of sense. Because you have the one on the e file, that always makes sense for an isolated pawn position. The one on the d file guards the weak d4 pawn, so it requires one more attacker from black to break through. And it also helps prepare d5 if that ever comes a possibility, which we see a little bit later in this game. So rook a d1 makes perfect sense. g6, probably a little bit too passive. Black needed to get his own play. Queen c7 actually gains a tempo because it hits that bishop on c2. And this is probably equal for black. Both sides have a good play here. Black can continue with either getting queenside play or sort of blockading up the center and trying to trade off some white's pieces to get to an ending. But white has the bishop pair, he has active pieces, he can push for a kingside attack from here. So both sides can be very happy with this position. g6 is a little bit passive. And then bishop e3. The nice logic of this move, once you've teased out the move g6 from black's kingside, unless you plan h4, h5 to further hammer on the g6 pawn, it often makes more sense to just move the bishop back to this a2 to g8 diagonal. Because in a lot of ways, that diagonal is where that bishop belongs to begin with. So in this position, white decided that he wasn't going to invest the time to prepare h4, h5, because in this particular position, it's very hard to achieve. So it's much more reasonable to just put the bishop back and then try to pressure the kingside in other ways, like a sacrifice on f7 or a sacrifice on e6 somehow. So I think this is the right move, so I think this is a good play from Romanishin. Rook e8. This is a very non-logical move. Because that bishop went back to b3, the square f7 is absolutely key in these positions. The knight's hitting that pawn, the bishop's x-raying through to that pawn. That can become a very weak square in these sorts of structures. So moving guardianship away from that pawn just doesn't make sense. Queen b6, in my opinion, made a lot more sense. It sort of proactively guards the e6 pawn, which can be a landing space for certain sacrifices here. There are a couple different lines. I don't want to spend too much time on them, but just notice that the discovered attack doesn't really work here. And black just pins the bishop to the queen. Black is fine here. If instead white plays a4, knight c3, this is a nice little tactic. Blocks the guardianship of the bishop on b3, and then gets that dangerous piece off the board. And this would be a pretty interesting hanging pawns position. Should be balanced, maybe a little bit better for white, but nothing staggering at all. This is a perfectly balanced position. But rook e8, it's passive, and it weakens the f7 square, so overall, white's very happy with this move. Rook fe1, one alternative I gave. h4 is also an interesting idea. But rook fe1 makes a huge amount of sense, because it's aiming... The f7 pawn is newly weakened, which makes the e6 pawn also weak. So rook fe1, it develops his last piece, and it aims at that potentially weak pawn. So now we're down the road. Knight d6, this is completely mistimed. This should look familiar from our first part of the series when we were looking at d4, d5 pushes. Both the rooks are on the d and the e file. The bishop's on b3, the queen is on d3, knight's on e5. Everything is set up for a d4, d5 break. Black needs to emergency stop that break with knight d5. He just needs to physically stop that break from happening. Knight d6. In the game, Romanishin played bishop h6, but d5 is absolutely appropriate here. And all these moves are basically forced. And then g3 is sort of a nice tidying up move. White has a huge advantage here. The pawn on f7 is incredibly weak, and white's already got two pieces aimed there. Bishop c5 is a natural follow-up, taking away the only guardian of that pawn. White has a huge edge in mobility. He has a huge edge in mobilization. Black's on the verge here. This is a fantastic position for white. But in the game, Romanishin chose not to break. Played bishop h6. Queen b6, this is a mistake. He needed to manually block off the attack on the king side with knight d5. He needed to block that incredibly powerful bishop out. But queen b6, bishop g5, queen f3 was more accurate here, because it's immediately aiming at all the squares that are the critical squares. The f7 square is absolutely critical, so white can aim directly there with his queen. The d5 square is critical for black's defense, so white puts another source of fire on that square to prevent knight d5. Just quick light knight d5, bishop d2, g3, and white has a very simple plan. He can play h4 and then h5 here and continue to open things up on the king side. And if he opens the h-file, he can simply play king g2 and then move a rook to the h-file, and that's very hard for black to parry. But bishop g5 is played, not a bad move, but not the most incisive. Then knight fe4. Once again, he's not feeling the danger of the position. Knight d5 is almost critical here, because he needs to block out that incredibly dangerous light squared bishop. Basically, the end of the game comes because black doesn't adequately diagnose his danger. He doesn't feel the attacking energy of white's pieces, and that's more or less his entire downfall. But knight d5 is completely necessary here. Challenge the bishop on g5, but mostly to block out that dangerous bishop on b3. But knight f4 just leaves black hanging. So bishop f4. Knight c3. This was black's last chance, really. Queen b5 was a more tenacious move, but after queen f3, and I give some lines in the game, but after knight f7, black is completely busted here. This is getting white's completely breaking through on the king side. So look through the notes that I have in the comments below the video. I don't want to make the video too long, but I do give some comprehensive analysis of this position here. But queen b5 is the best choice to try to make white find those moves. Knight c3, not nearly as tenacious. Then knight xg6. So this is sort of what I meant about a classic isolated queen pawn attack with no pawn breaks. And this, in a certain way, this is more like an e-pawn opening. In d-pawn openings, you tend to see more pawn marches to open up the position, where in e-pawn openings, you see more pawn sacrifices, and then pieces being the things to open things up. Here, it's just the white pieces throwing themselves into the breach to open the position up. So knight xg6, that bishop on b3 is going to be the star of this attack. Notice how many black pieces are just stuck on the other side of the board. The queen on b6 is stuck away from the king side. The knight on c3 is stuck away from the king side. Both rooks can't reach the king side. Black just doesn't have a lot of material to defend with on the king side. Whereas white has pretty much his entire army at his disposal to go after the black king. And that sort of localized superiority of material is what makes white's attack work here. So knight xg6 open things up. Just a couple simple variations. If black takes on d1, then that's absolutely crushing. And then if black takes the bishop on b3, this is also completely crushing. The knight on c3 is pinned now, can't even take the rook on d1. And then white's just going to follow either queen g3 check, or you could just take the knight on c3 and be a piece up. But hxg6, and then bishop xe6. So the bishop is the complete star of this attack. Sacrifices itself to open up the king side. And it's that localized superiority of material that is causing white's attack to be victorious here. None of black's pieces are in place to defend any part of the king side. So, knight f5, that's the most tenacious move, just to show the main threat here. If he takes the bishop, bishop e5, and that's mate soon. If king g7, white can take, and then white's down a piece, but he already has 3 pawns for the piece, and he's got a mating attack to go along with it. Like, the 3 pawns are just sort of like an emergency backstop in case he miscalculates something. But the 3 pawns aren't really relevant. It's white's mating attack and the fact that he's breaking through that's completely relevant. But knight f5 is the most tenacious move, but white finds the right way to continue. Bishop c8, then bishop takes f5. White's even up 2 pawns here, and he has a mating attack to go along with it. So knight xb2, queen g3. So now all of white's pieces are trained right at the king side, and black's pieces aren't coordinated enough to do anything about it. And I'll just show the last few moves of the game quickly, since it's basically a rout after this. Queen f6, just drops the bishop back, and then preparing stuff like bishop e5 or bishop a2 or bishop g5. Rook d8, bishop e5. Queen e6 is more tenacious. He played queen h4, but even after queen e6, f4, he's just going to play f5 and crush open the king side. This position's completely gone for black. So queen h4, and then queen b3. Then Ljubojevic flag fell here, but he's completely busted. Even if the knight on b2 weren't trapped, white's pawn up, and he has a mating attack to go with it, but he's going to win the knight on b2. So, convincing game. Really, the decisive parts of the game was much earlier, around this position. As we said with the, if you remember Botvinnik's game against Vidmar, we said it's important to get your own counterplay instead of just having a nice-looking position. In this position, black chose bishop d7. Look how much more appropriate b5 is, because black is actually fighting for space. He's fighting for his own chances. And here, black actually has aggressive intentions. He can follow up with rook c8 and create pressure on the queen side. Bishop d7 is just so passive. Just allowed white to build up. None of these moves for black really have a threat. Rook e8 doesn't have a threat. In fact, it even weakens the f7 square. But here, white's just able to build up with no counter threat whatsoever. Never defend passively. Never allow your opponent to build up at will. If you just allow your opponent to build up and tee off without having to worry about counterplay from you, you're going to be hard-pressed to defend those positions every time. Typically, the attack always breaks through, just because it's much harder to defend than attack. So this is another classic example of that, and also a classic example of an isolated queen pawn and creating weaknesses strictly with pieces instead of with a pawn break. So excellent game from Romanishin. We're going to continue this series tomorrow with another example of isolated queen pawn attacking play, and then we're going to move on to the other side, how black is actually supposed to play against an isolated queen pawn. So my name is John, also Cybertal, and I will see you then.